Okay, everybody. Good afternoon. I think we can begin, and everybody who is attending a little late may join later. I wanted to say thank you to everyone, all the panelists and the organization of the HPA. My name is Rafael Bolsa. I am the HPA chair, not the HPA chair. I'm sorry, the HPA International Law Section chair, and I am welcoming here the panelists Pablo de Montes, Ellis, Claudia, Valdivia, and John Drimmer to participate in this panel related to Latin America, ESG, and the participation of Chinese companies in the LATAM market. I'm going to introduce the panelists, starting with Claudia. Claudia works for Internet para Todos in Peru. She is head of compliance and ESG, and she's in charge of leading the design, implementation, and reporting of ESG strategies and compliance programs, providing guidance to the board of directors and the company in general as to those topics. She is an administrator from the University of Piura and has a master's in risk governance and compliance from Madrid. She is certified as Global Compliance Manager and Project Manager, and she has studied both in Harvard and other Ivy League universities. She has long experience in this topic and will give us a view from the ground on this interesting issues. Next up, I'm going to introduce Evan Ellis. Evan is Research Professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College and Strategic Studies Institute, with a focus on the region's relationship with China and other non-Western Hemisphere actors. Dr. Ellis, Evan, has published over 300 works. He has a long list of works, including books on China specifically and its relationship with Latin America, as listed in the slide. He's currently working on another book, and on top of his teaching, he spends some time writing. Dr. Ellis previously served as Secretary of State Policy Planning Staff and responsibility for Latin America and the Caribbean, and also in the area of narcotics and drug enforcement. Dr. Ellis has also been awarded the Order of Military Merit Jose Maria Cordova by the Colombian government for his scholarship in the region. Next is Jonathan Drimmer. And Jonathan is an attorney partner of the firm of Paul Hastings, and he's co-chair of the firm's ESG and Compliance Strategy Practice, is one of the leading attorneys in the topic, and he has represented and advised companies, individuals, governments, NGOs, and multi-stakeholder initiatives on all aspects of business and human rights and ESG, including compliance programs. He is not a newcomer to the topic. He has been involved in ESG for a long time, even before the topic was very trendy in the news and in general in the circles of compliance. In addition to Paul Hastings, John Drimmer was Vice President and General Counsel for Barrick Gold, and he has long experience working in difficult areas of the world. Last but not least, my friend Pablo de Montes. Pablo and I have worked together for over 30 years doing different activities. Pablo is a graduate from the University of Lima and has a Master of Laws from Pittsburgh, if I'm not mistaken. He is now a managing director of Gryphon Strategies, and he administrates or works in DC and Miami with direct practice in Latin America, although he has also worked in other areas of the world involving investigative matters, financial fraud, bribery, corruption, and antitrust. He travels frequently or used to travel frequently to do courses and trainings all over the Latin American region, as well as other areas of the world. as well as, you see there Africa, Europe, Middle East, and Asia. He has consulted with several companies on investigations regarding potential FCPA violations. And Pablo is very active in this topic as well. With that introduction and without further ado, I turn it over to Pablo, who is going to moderate this fascinating discussion. And I wish all of you a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rafael. I just want to thank you, thank the Houston Bar Association for the opportunity to be speaking about this interesting subject. This subject, as you can imagine, is not something that a lot of people are talking. A lot of people are talking about ESG, and the subject, came since a year ago. Claudia, John, and I wrote an article together regarding what then was the upcoming wave of the ESG due diligence in Latin America. Now, as you can imagine, you just have to go on browse and LinkedIn, and everybody's talking about ESG. However, we wanted to give a second step and say, okay, how things are going on there, and we saw we saw analyzing whether there's a fair competition with Chinese-backed and Chinese companies in Latin America, and whether there could be a result, a fair competition. That's why we invited my friend, Dr. Evan Ellis, who is the expert in China and Latin America. So you see here, this is a screen of an app called Living Earth, okay? So I took the screen a couple of days ago. So, the big circle here is Lima. But then you see a city in the, this is the coast, and this is some lights. And I always thought, what are these lights, right? So there's a lot, it seems like there's an Atlantis or a city in the sea. And, the answer for this was, these are Chinese fisheries and Chinese factory boats. And my question here is, what are the ESG rules here? How they're applied? Who's overseeing how things are going? Just so very close to the coast of Peru. So therefore, I'll make the introduction to Evan, who's going to explain to us, what has been the presence of China in Latin America for the past recent years, and what we could foresee in the future. And what are his views regarding strong Chinese presence and aggressive Chinese presence in Latin America? Evan, please go ahead. You're mute, I guess. You're still on mute, Evan.
Thank you very much, Pablo, and thanks to the group and for the opportunity to share my views with all of you. Although I currently work for the U.S. Army War College, I want to emphasize that these are my personal opinions and not in any way of the U.S. government. My role here today is to talk about Chinese activities in Latin America, to give a little bit of a background in some of the challenges that Chinese companies have found and presented from an ESG standpoint in their activities, especially over the past 20 years in Latin America. So I'm going to start out with a little bit of background about China entering the region in general. In my own work, I've followed this since about 2003. I've come to the conclusion that the vast majority of Chinese activities globally are relatively consistent region to region. It tends to be economically oriented, although there certainly is a political and institutional component as well to China's focus. But overall, with the backing of the Chinese state and the coordination in many different projects, what you find is that generally Chinese SOEs, as well as independent and other Chinese companies, are engaging in Latin America as elsewhere, looking for secure access to commodities as well as foodstuffs to feed the 1.4 billion Chinese people, as well as access to markets, especially strategic markets in technology and other areas, particularly high value, and associated technologies that are critical to the advance in those sectors. Along the way, of course, the Chinese companies seek to dominate the value added in those operations from the extractive sectors to the markets, as well as the logistics associated with the movement back and forth. In general, when we talk about, of course, China's orientation focused on the Belt and Road Initiative, which it rolled out officially in 2013 and extended to Latin America and the Caribbean in 2018 with Panama signing on, although it's not always clear what the obligations of country signatories are, other than believing that they are plugging themselves into the money machine of receiving favorable loans and infrastructure opportunities in investment from China. Right now, you've had about 19 Latin American countries in the Belt and Road Initiative. And as well as a complement, I should mention that there are 5 Latin American countries which are part of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which supports that, and 3 other candidate members at this point. When you say, how did this happen? In general, you see the explosion of Chinese commercial engagement with the region taking off in Latin America, like in other places in the world. After 2001, when China is accepted into the World Trade Organization, most of that engagement in Latin America was with respect to trade until you get to the 2007-2008 global economic crisis. About 2 years afterwards, in 2010, you see, especially in the petroleum sector, as well as in the mining sector and elsewhere, really an explosion of presence of Chinese companies, initially through mergers and acquisition. And with that presence, especially as Chinese companies bought into those operations, you saw an escalation of conflict as Chinese companies had to deal with local laborers and dealing with local governments and local communities, and the steep learning process associated with that. At the same time, however, those conditions, including security conditions and other conditions and political conditions that affected the Chinese companies operating on the ground, forced those Chinese companies not only with respect to their laws and Chinese government oversight, but more broadly to have to be concerned about what local conditions were in Latin America. Along the way, also, as Chinese companies got better at working with local partners and gaining expertise and relating to those communities, they arguably also began to expand the effectiveness of their influence in a manner that was commensurate with their increasing role. Again, as I emphasized, the story of Chinese engagement in each sector in Latin America and elsewhere is a bit different. So again, in sectors such as mining and in petroleum, the tendency was that the Chinese companies initially especially bought in mining areas where the engineering work was already done and there was a need for an infusion of capital, something similar in the petroleum sector. In agriculture, the Chinese companies initially tried to set up agro-logistics activities, such as the one by Chongqing Grain in Bahia in Brazil. But with time, the greatest Chinese success in agriculture as well has come from mergers and acquisition, with the acquisition of Moderator and Noble in 2014 by China Oilseeds and Foodstuffs Corporation, and then channeling some of that COFCO demand through those companies, oftentimes in competition with the established agro-logistics giants like Gryphon and Bunge and ADM, but also interacting in new ways with local communities. You see a different type of dynamics in the electricity sector, where again, mergers and acquisitions, about $30 billion worth of new activity, principally by the company State Grid, but also by China Three Gorges and by State Power Industry Corporation, SPIC, to name a few. In other sectors, for example, in telecommunication, it's been more of a ground-up approach with companies like Huawei and ZTE. And that ground-up approach has made them somewhat better as they've learned in integrating local managers and local partners and local technicians, even integrating with local communities, sponsoring soccer teams and things like that. At the same time, others, for example, in the manufacturing sector, you saw Chinese automotive producers such as Chery and BYD and others setting up CKD factories in the region, and again, having to deal with local labor forces. But because they had the help of the people who had the original distribution networks who helped brought them in some cases, that was a little bit smoother. So the trajectory in each sector has been a little bit different. To a certain extent as well, by state, it's been a little bit different. And so, for example, some of the big construction projects initially went forward with populous states such as Venezuela, to a lesser extent in the hydroelectric sector, and others in Ecuador, in road construction in Bolivia. It also went forward in the Caribbean, where there were relatively small governments who were open to special government-to-government deals with the Chinese, and who frankly needed the capital. So in Jamaica, you saw some major investments. Also in the port sector, you've seen a major presence there. Over time, however, Chinese companies have become more sophisticated and have begun to participate in public-private partnership projects, which have allowed them to begin winning important infrastructure work, and thus having to interface with local in more institutionalized governments with higher levels of oversight, such as, for example, Chile, where they recently won an important segment of Highway 5, and in Colombia, of course, where famously they won a multi-billion-dollar contract to build the Bogota Metro, among others. Another important aspect to understand is the Chinese do not just either build a greenfield presence or buy in immediately with the majority stakes. Traditionally, often the Chinese have gotten partway in by acquiring minority stakes. You see this in petroleum and mining through acquisitions of minority stakes in companies like Perenco and Galp, in rare earth mining with the 15% stake in CBMM in Brazil, with respect to public-private partnership construction projects with the acquisition of a minority stake by China Communications and Construction Corporation of Mode Engil, and of course in the petroleum sector, the $15 billion acquisition of Nexen, which gave China a stake in the Stabroek oil fields, for example, off of the coast of Guyana. And there's some reason to believe that that will continue to expand even farther, just like after the 2008 financial crisis, after the COVID crisis and associated economic difficulties. There are many reasons to believe that the Chinese will be favorably positioned to expand their presence through mergers and acquisition as European and Western companies look to sell off their holdings in poorly performing markets, such as parts of Latin America, and also where Chinese companies with their financial partners in China provide needed expansion through greenfield projects and others. In general, to give a snapshot of where we are right now, or at least right before the pandemic, China's put about $160 billion in non-financial foreign direct investment in the region. And while that is still less than the sunk FDI of, for example, the United States, it is still substantial. And the coordination with the state means that it tends to get a lot of attention from local governments and local business partners. With respect to loans, the two major Chinese policy banks, China Development Bank and China Exim, have put in about $136 billion into the region. Although because of COVID-19, as well as the collapse of Venezuela, which was once one of China's major source of borrowing, that has fallen off over the past approximately 2 years. Yet the fundamentals are still there, and it's poised to take off again with a number of populist governments who are in the region open to those type of deals. On the trade front, again, about $330 billion of bilateral trade before COVID hit. It's down to about $312 billion now, which compares to about $709 billion of U.S. trade with the region. So it is substantially less than the United States. However, when you look at South America, gone down south, China is either the #1 trading partner with most of the countries in South America, or #2, but #2 behind Brazil. In addition, it's important to recognize the role with all of this influence of PRC, what I call soft power. And the point that I like to make, and I think this is very important for understanding ESG and actually demanding appropriate ESG behavior from Chinese firms, is that oftentimes local government elites, as well as local business elites, are motivated not by value affinity or principles, although there's some of that, but hoped for benefits from being the partners to the Chinese firms or receiving investment from China. What that tends to mean, however, is that there's an oftentimes temptation to silence oneself for governments or for businesses not to be critical either of Chinese behavior in Asia itself, whether it's talking about Hong Kong or Xinjiang or other things, suppression of discourse, but also within different projects in Latin America. Also, people-to-people diplomacy plays an important role for China's advance in the region. There are about 39 Confucius Institutes in the region. One of the powers of this is it means that a large number of those Latin American young elites who are the new generation of technocrats who have learned Mandarin Chinese or have learned the Chinese character set and developed expertise, a really deep expertise on China. Many of them got that expertise through Hanban scholarships in China itself. And so you have some challenges in which some of the most expert on China in the region, making their government policy or dealing with their business policy on that, have a debt of gratitude to the Chinese state itself for the source of that expertise, which puts them in that position. Next slide, please. And so with this, I'd just like to say a few things about Chinese ESG patterns in Latin America. Like other things, the experience does vary by sector. Also, the way in which those firms entered. So, for example, even in the mining sector, you see significant differences in a country like Peru between China Aluminum Corporation, which has been in the sector for a number of years and has learned and made some good choices relatively about local partners and local consultants, especially in dealing with environmental issues, and thus has done a relatively credible job, although not without problems, in the negotiations with the community to relocate the community of Morococho off of the top of the copper mine, which it wished to exploit. Other companies, for example, China Min Metals, not necessarily any fault of their own, but with a relatively rapid acquisition of terrain such as the Las Bambas mine, has had a significant number of difficulties with the local communities there. In addition, sometimes the type of firm has an impact. So again, in telecommunications, you find that from the very beginning, companies like Huawei have been forced to integrate local managers and local technicians and others, customer service personnel, into their staffs. And so that has arguably helped them in dealing better with some of the issues of local laws and labor practices and things like that. And there was an issue of resources as well. Sometimes the larger SOEs like State Grid have opportunities for hiring local partners or hiring consultants or doing certain internal training activities for their managerial and technical personnel that smaller firms that may be coming in, especially at the sub-SOE level, may not have. Beyond that, again, it's important to emphasize that the overall trend is that Chinese companies, as they continue on the ground, are learning from their experience. They're learning from the local partners that they work with to navigate that terrain more effectively. And they are little by little, through selective acquisitions and contracts, gaining certain capabilities that help them to interface, not only to have technical capabilities, but interface more effectively with local communities and local governments. Overall, though, some patterns of concern, you do see a tendency of what I call a predatory style. In some cases, because Chinese government enforcement of the laws they have on the books can be lax if it's not directly embarrassing or pressuring the Chinese government. You often see somewhat of a predatory style in terms of commitment by some firms to environmental laws or local labor laws. You also see one of the challenges with respect to the degree to which there are use of other things such as some interesting contractual approaches. So a few just general things, although it's difficult to generalize and sometimes unfair, but many of the Chinese companies have a preference for their own workers on the at the ground level, again because of issues of language and labor practices and things like that, but also often at the managerial level. You have oftentimes a preference for Chinese companies to use their own subcontractors. So in the petroleum sector, you will find Chinese petroleum service firms such as CPEB or Caroui or others who will follow the majors in. You will find, again, there's oftentimes a preference by Chinese companies if they can negotiate what I would call regulatory autonomy. And so especially special economic zones, the Chinese oftentimes prefer to have those type of things because it gives them flexibility in the way that they manage labor as well as paying taxes and other things to increase their efficiency. I mentioned previously before the practice of what I call lawfare. Specifically, it's very common for Chinese, especially large Chinese companies, to have some very onerous contract provisions. We've seen before, for example, how the use of very cleverly crafted arbitration clauses was used in the case of Bahamar in the Bahamas to actually strip that project away from Sarkis's Merlion there and put it into the hands of a Macau-based firm, Chow Tai Fook Enterprises, largely because the arbitration required an arbitration to be done in Hong Kong and not in the Bahamas or the United States, where the local partner as Merlion was more comfortable. Also, cross-default clauses. So here again, if you cut one project, you could lose the funding for a different Chinese project. This became an issue, for example, in Argentina, where the incoming government wanted to cancel projects that it believed were not in the country's interests in the Santa Cruz, near the Santa Cruz River, 2 hydroelectric projects, but found that if it did so, it would the Chinese could call in their right to actually cancel funding for the strategically important work on the Belgrano-Cargas rail project, which actually also happened to be a project in which the president, then Mauricio Macri's father, before passing away, was the local partner. And so cross-default clauses oftentimes creating a lock-in effect, oftentimes sovereign guarantees. A wonderful study that was done emphasizing how these sovereign guarantees, the Chinese will often ask a local government, for example, in the case of Ecuador, to actually guarantee funding, even though the actual on the books project was done by a local entity. This creates a risk not only of liabilities to the sovereign government, but also the degrees to which those liabilities, because of other clauses, are oftentimes not known or not fully transparent. Also, the use of parallel contracts, famously Venezuela with the, so to speak, loans for oil contracts, and also Ecuador, although the Chinese have also used this in Africa and other places, basically increasing the security of their payment, but also oftentimes creating some obligations of concerns on local government and also some difficulty in pricing. Some things that repeatedly come up is sometimes the propensity of some Chinese companies to offer essentially off-the-books personal benefits, not always cash bribes, but sometimes subcontracts going to family or friends of the government officials who are signing the deal. In a number of the hydroelectric projects, there are many serious accusations of this in Ecuador, especially under the previous Correa government and Vice President Jorge Glass. There have been oftentimes some serious performance issues. Famously, the Cococura-Sinclair Dam project in Ecuador, where again you had about 400 defects that were subsequently identified by an audit by a German firm after it was built. The Anaco Railway, oftentimes in populist states where there is less clear technical oversight, Chinese propensity to get behind schedule or try to get away with poor performance becomes more of a factor. Hiring and pay issues are a recurrent problem, whether enough locals are being hired, as was the accusations in the Guyana Marriott, whether locals are being given expected bonuses or, oftentimes the letter of the law and not the way that things are traditionally done in dealing with local labor forces. This was an object of some concern in Jamaica during the construction of the Palisades Road project, or again, some difficulties that led to just a series of strikes against Sinohydro in road construction projects in Bolivia, just to mention a few concrete cases. Again, oftentimes it's not that the Chinese never adhere to regulations, but typically that the more opportunities there are for lax government oversight or lax regulatory enforcement, there's a certain subset of Chinese companies that famously try to cut their corners on regulation. This was a big problem with a company called Baishan Lin in Guyana, which was involved in logging and construction activities before finally being kicked out of the country by that government. This was a problem with essentially illegal dredging and illegal use of excess Chinese workers in the Panama Colón container port project before that project went belly up because of problems with one of the local Chinese partners. And of course, as Pablo mentioned, the vast problems with the Chinese deepwater fleet in IUU fishing. By extension, environmental and safety issues, again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into all of the detail, but there are examples across the region. One of the famous one was basically the shoddy construction of a tailings pond in a mine by a company by the name of Jungi in Bolivia, which resulted in it collapsing and essentially, lethal metallic contaminated water contaminated the local groundwater, actually resulting in a number of deaths and other problems. Or for example, some of the problems that Andes Petroleum got involved with in Ecuador and in places like Tarapo and Orellana. And of course, finally, oftentimes the combination of that corner cutting and sometimes the sometimes difficult ways in which the Chinese managers relate to the communities has led to social protests, has led to violence, has led to an attempt to shut down and push back things. So in mines such as Marcona in Peru, I mentioned, of course, the Las Bambas project. In Perura, the Rio Blanco mining project, which was associated with a lot of violence and community pushback. But it doesn't just extend to Peru, especially in the south of Ecuador, a very environmentally sensitive area, dealing kind of running roughshod on some of the sensitivity of the local peoples, including the Shuar people with respect to the Mirador and the San Carlos Pantanza mine there. So again, this isn't to say that all Chinese companies are bad, but I highlight that combination of learning and experience in Chinese practices causes a certain subset of Chinese companies to have some significant performance and compliance problems and associated social difficulties, which become a problem not only for the performance of the Chinese company itself and the local government contracting it, but for the broader context. So that's my brief overview. And again, a privilege to be part of this, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Evan, for such a great and amazing overview of the situation of Chinese companies in Latin America. So now we're going to go and discuss, from the private perspective. We have John Drimmer, as Rafael said. John is someone that has been talking about these subjects for a long time, and before they became fashion. So, John, please go ahead.
That's right. Thank you, Pablo. I was into ESG before it became cool. So that was great. Thank you, Evan, for that in-depth briefing in terms of the Chinese market, and certainly mirrors what I've seen, which is you really can't treat Chinese companies as unitary within Latin America or anywhere in terms of their ESG practices, though we have certainly seen some challenging trends in Latin America. And there is a real distinction that we see in terms of behavior of Chinese companies, generalizing within China versus outside of China as well. And so a real variation in performance based on geography and the nature of the entity. But I am going to talk about something different today. And I am going to focus a little bit more generally on, when we talk about ESG, what are we really talking about? Where does it come from? And ultimately, with the object of providing a lens that then can be applied to some of the activities that Evan ultimately described and that Claudia is going to be talking about as well. And by way of introduction, ESG and the concept of ESG has existed for a long time, many years. And in some ways, the concept of CSR has now morphed into ESG as we now talk about it. And it really comes about as we're rethinking the role of companies in society. And for years and years, generations, companies and their boards really focused on financial materiality as the sole driver of performance. Social issues, environmental issues, governance issues, these mattered as they impacted financial performance. Now that's changed over the past decade plus, and it's really changed in the last couple of years. Isn't to say that financial materiality, financial performance isn't key. It remains the key driver of any for-profit entity. But what we are seeing now is what's sometimes called double materiality, or salient risks and impacts, or ESG performance, stakeholder capitalism. All of these terms generally mean the impact that companies have on stakeholders, local communities, and society outside of their ultimate financial returns. Impact on employees, on suppliers, on customers, on third parties that are impacted by climate. All of these issues now come together under the rubric of ESG. So to talk a little bit about what it is and why people should care, it really falls into three different categories. There are environmental issues, and you see a lot of the sub-issues that ultimately come up under environment. You see S, which is really the impact that companies and businesses can have on people, on local communities. You see G, governance, and the issues we think about when we talk about governance. And before talking about these in a little bit more detail, and a little bit about how these ultimately might apply to Chinese companies and to different sectors, one thing that's really quite important to understand, that when we talk about ESG, we aren't just talking about the impacts about your own responsibilities as a business enterprise. We are talking about that. We're talking about subsidiaries and entities that you ultimately control. We're also talking about your value chain, your suppliers and your customers and end users, and the leverage you might be able to exercise over those entities that you ultimately don't control, and the expectation and the responsibility, the perceived responsibility for businesses. And again, this is to some extent applicable as we think about Chinese companies operating in Latin America. We think about what kind of leverage can companies exercise over those with whom they do business. What kind of pressure, what kind of conditions can they put on the nature of those relationships? And so it isn't just your business, it is also your subsidiaries, it is also those entities that you do contract with. So to pull out some of the key pieces that we see when we look at the E, when we look at the S, when we look at the G, obviously some of these issues are going to cut across virtually all industries. So for instance, under E, most businesses these days will have some connection to climate and climate footprint. Under S, most companies today are thinking about issues related to diversity, and on G, board diversity issues. They are thinking about issues like board composition and discrimination and harassment. So there are certain issues in the ESG space that are going to apply regardless of the sector you operate in, the geography you operate in, and the nature of your specific operations. And that is going to include, as we think about companies operating in China and companies doing business with companies operating in China, as we think about how ESG is going to apply more broadly in terms of the expectations right now. But for most other businesses, you will have ESG related risks that go beyond just that standard set that we talk about that apply much more broadly. And companies often identify these based on A, looking at the sector they're in and the common risks for the sector, B, common risks they see in the geography. And obviously with Latin America, we can think about common ESG risks that do exist in the region. And then 3, the nature of their own processes and programs, including the maturity level of their ESG related policies, programs, and systems. You can help get some of the basics in terms of what exists for your sector from benchmarking, from things like the SASB and SASB, basically the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, if I can get that out, lists the relevant sustainability issues, about 26 different sustainability issues across a range of sectors, and that helps identify what are typically seen as the significant or material issues from a sustainability standpoint and ESG standpoint in those sectors. S&P Global has its set of standards as well. And again, so you can pull from that what you're typically seeing in the sector, and you can do similar types of benchmarking when you're thinking about geography as well. And there are lots of good resources that folks can look at to see what the challenges might exist within the geography. But applying it to your own systems and processes is really where the rubber hits the road, and understanding how it is you go about applying your ESG approach to your own operations, to those you do business with, which may include Chinese companies that are operating in the region, in the sector. That's a little bit more difficult, and that does really depend on a focus on your program, your processes, gaps, the maturity level, issues that you've had come up, how you deal with them, and things along those lines. So bottom line here is, again, when we think about ESG, we are thinking about a set of emerging norms and standards that cuts across the E, the S, and the G that are going to apply to virtually all companies in some similar ways and some ways that are unique to their business and where they operate, but will absolutely apply when we think about Chinese companies that are operating in the region, again, particularly from a Western side. So let's talk it next. We go to the next slide a little bit around not just what it is, but why should companies care? As the previous slide said, it really comes, it's a combination of soft and hard law norms that really drives ESG and the standards that we think about when we talk about ESG more generally. And one of the areas that we're seeing the most growth in, and this is why companies and others should care in particular, other than the fact that it is good to care about ESG and this creates value in society and avoids negative impacts on people, etc., is that we are in a rapidly changing environment where legal risk is growing exponentially as we think about ESG related issues, and that's the red box up on the screen. Right now, ESG is really on the radar for legal and regulatory changes. And you see some of the examples that are in the bullets on the left. Some of these laws are already in place, like modern slavery laws, conflict minerals requirements, forced labor import laws that prevent you from bringing goods into your country if there's a reasonable suspicion that they were created with forced labor, gig worker rights, which is really moving fairly quickly through Latin America and through other regions and countries as well. All of these are now firmly in place. You have laws in the United States, including the TVPRA, Trafficking Victim Protection Reauthorization Act, that allow for civil and criminal cases to be brought based on issues related to modern slavery that that occur abroad. Some of it, though, is also being proposed. And so, for instance, the first bullet, draft EU Corporate Due Diligence and Accountability Directive, is been talked about now throughout most of this year and for about 12 months now. A very broad EU requirement that's still in draft form. We're waiting for the final draft to come out from the Commission. It came out from the Legal Affairs Committee earlier in the year. And this would be a sweeping law that requires mandatory human rights due diligence, and due diligence not only for human rights, but also for environmental issues and for governance issues, including anti-corruption, tax evasion, and undue political influence. And it would apply to any company doing business in the EU, based in the EU, or doing business in the EU, and it would have enormous ramifications because anybody who's doing business with a company who's doing business in the EU is going to be subject to that due diligence. So we have very broad laws that are already in place. We have others that are being proposed and moving fairly quickly, and it is really changing the nature of the overall regulatory environment, particularly in the United States, where international regulatory and compliance requirements are integrating the ESG factors, and in the EU, where we have a very rapidly moving regional and domestic set of legal changes. But we're also seeing a lot of pressure come from investors. And this is something that boards and senior management have to respond to as investors, whether it's institutional investors or shareholders, are really putting pressure on management regarding their ESG practices. We're seeing ESG pricing as part of lending decisions. Rates are ultimately tied to ESG performance. We're seeing stock exchange rules related to ESG reporting and disclosures, other areas of performance. I think we're going to see a lot more growth in this area coming up. We're seeing proxy fights and shareholder resolutions, including putting in place new board members at some of the biggest companies in the world, focusing on ESG related issues and changes. And so ultimately, we are seeing a wide variety of issues coming up through investors as they do reflect ESG related challenges, which does put pressure on directors and boards. The third thing we're seeing is a real mobilization by communities and stakeholders, and that would include workers in particular, as workforces around the world who are able to communicate much more effectively through social media are able to get together and put pressure on companies and management and boards. And that's something we've really seen a great deal of around controversial issues over the last few years, and I do think is going to continue to grow as workforces see success that other workforces have in terms of changing company policy. We're also seeing a lot more pressure from local communities, as they're also able to communicate and talk to companies about operations. And this is an area, in fact, where we see some of the confluence of responses to Chinese companies in Latin America, where there have been negative responses to companies that aren't hiring locally, that are perceived to be negatively impacting local communities, local markets, that aren't procuring locally as a means of saving money, who are creating negative environmental impacts. And so it's that bullet around local community response where we have seen in Latin America and elsewhere real strong responses to Chinese companies and their operations. So there's stakeholder mobilization as well that's driving change. And then finally, there's a real perceived tie between strong ESG and financial performance. And ultimately, that means that executives are going to care about it, right? If ESG is seen as a proxy for good management, which is, again, something that boards and shareholders pay attention to, and if it's seen as a proxy for good management, that is something that senior managers and boards really do end up focusing on. And I'll just end with a statistic down there at the bottom. And so last year, there was a study that was done, a survey that was done by McKinsey, and it focused on C-suite leaders, focused on investment professionals, people who run, acquire, and invest in businesses. And the survey found, it's a terrific survey, and I highly recommend it to everybody. But of these who are really running and acquiring and investing in businesses, 83%, the overwhelming majority, recognized the rapid growth in the ESG space, and they said they would be willing to pay a 10% premium to acquire a company with a positive ESG record over one with a negative ESG record. So as we think about the most important people in the business space, they are putting a 10% premium on positive ESG performance. And truthfully, if you actually look at the numbers and the studies from more of a quantitative analysis, it's actually higher than that on a quant basis. So really, it is a material difference in terms of positive performance. And so when we think about the nature of engagements between companies who are doing business with Chinese companies in the region, the ESG pressure and the ESG lens is really quite an important one. But let me stop there. I've gone about 15 minutes. Let me stop there and hand it over to you, Pablo, and to you, Claudia, to keep going.
Well, thanks, John. Thank you very much for that. A great overview as well of the ESG. So now we're going with Claudia. Claudia's going to give us a little bit of from the trenches in Latin America. She's based in Peru, and what has been your experience right now with ESG and the struggle that we were discussing.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you everyone who has joined us today, this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. So as Evan mentioned before, between 2000 and 2019, China invested several billions in Latin America. Of course, there's increasing awareness and interest in ESG investment, and also Pablo mentioned who is taking care of this. So there is Chinese companies trying to emerge the crisis, Latin American companies willing to have that money to develop their countries, and who else is watching? I'm telling you, whatever is not being done by the countries or the government is being done by the communities. And John has been very clear that social license to operate is more than ever important, either as ESG, responsible mining, sustainability, or whatever you want to call it. Companies really need to care on what is going on with the communities around the operations. And this is not only a perspective from whoever is willing to invest as Chinese companies in Latin America, but also to Latin American companies or foreign companies operating in Latin America. Who are your third parties? What are they doing? What type of ESG due diligence are you running into your company to make sure you, either your third parties, are getting into these ESG problems? This is no longer a compliance perspective or an anti-corruption perspective. You need to care about the social component that John has very clear explained, and of course the environment. Latin America is well known to have magnificent characteristics, but also there are Chinese companies seeking to emerge this crisis, while there is a pressure from companies to provide relevant ESG reporting. Of course, we need to secure financing and maintaining their public social license to operate. And here is key. In fact, there is further developments of relationship between countries, which makes ESG criteria more and more prevalent in the day-to-day management of these organizations in Latin America. Yes, we have, as Latin American citizens and countries, several components that give the power to become a leading player for companies to emerge the crisis, but social license to operate is critical on these components. There's a growing debate about ESG criteria and its implementation in Latin America. Who is taking the lead on this? Who is responding to these communities' claims? There is the continent social reality that is putting us on top of these ESG components. Some of the sectors can most easily, of course, exploit and adjust to this ESG: agriculture, telecommunications, infrastructure, mining, technology. But in turn, some of those most attractive and fast-growing opportunities in Latin America are also, in fact, ESG reporting, where mandatory ESG has not been established yet. But again, even though ESG reporting has not been mandatory yet for those Latin American countries, there are increasing interest in those regulations to be up there. Initiatives, of course, are emerging and being promoted by several private organizations. IDB Invest, Bancolombia presented a few months ago, and actually in February last year, clearly index and bonus for those companies operating in Latin America who are seeking to invest in the ESG component. They need to contribute to the society, protect the environment, generate economic value, but also have a good corporate governance practice in place. And this is not limited to the financial sector only. We have Latin American companies, LATAM airlines actually, willing to implement a strategic and sustainability program from 30 years, and it's fully related to ESG components. So if we go to the next slide, please, Pablo. We have abundant resources and mineral resources in Latin America, which are actually an opportunity to attract a large portion of Chinese companies and investments, but also, unfortunately, those numbers are not always matching the results in Latin America, considering that we have registered the greatest number of social environmental conflicts related to mining in the world, for example. So where is the clash here? What are we doing to ensure those well-explained ESG concepts are being put in practice and in place in Latin American companies? Again, this is a call to action for Chinese businesses and to every potential investor, but also for every compliance officer, legal department of Latin American based companies, to ensure we are running an appropriate due diligence in terms of who are we working with, who are our third parties, and a responsible supply chain from the start, from end-to-end process. Strong ESG practices in Latin America for Chinese companies can surely create a more resilient business and help Chinese companies avoid this clash we're talking about, while of course investing in Latin America. Chinese companies need to take action to further enhance their ESG reporting. Communities are asking to do so, not only to Chinese companies actually, but to every company operating in Latin America. And of course, we need to have a holistic performance, a more effective response to domestic and global stakeholders. And here, local communities must be considered a stakeholder as well. They can stop your social license to operate, or they can make your company success in this Latin American operation. Of course, as compliance officers, again, we need to take part of that. We cannot have a closed eye in terms of this perspective. We need to address our ESG due diligence in a way that we can identify any potential issues with our partners, clients, stakeholders. And if we go to the last slide, please, Pablo. there are several implications here. Like, what are the implications for this trend and Chinese companies and investors in Latin America? We have all discussed during the past hour that Latin American countries are full of opportunities, but also complexities. So we need to have these complexities in mind when developing operations in Latin America. Compliance considerations, cultural considerations, and of course, communities considerations. The greater the presence of ESG criteria, the greater the need for specific local knowledge. Evan has already mentioned there are Chinese companies operating here willing to hire local workforce to ensure we can have a clear understanding of the environmental operating environment. Of course, ESG is very, very important these days in anything you do in Latin America. Investors and of course the society and local communities are interested in making sure whatever project is come out and whatever investment is being done in Latin America is taken care from the ESG point of view. The good news is that we have seen and we are seeing here in Latin America a trend for Chinese companies to do ESG voluntary reporting, sustainable practices, and they are leading the example, either because they have learned that that's the only way to succeed in these Latin American countries, or because they are feeling the pressure from communities and from investors. So I'll give it over to you, Pablo, for the last minute of questions.
Thank you, Claudia. That's a great approach to all this. So if for everybody attending, you have any questions, you can use the Q&A part of our presentation. However, I have some questions here. I guess we can start the open discussion here. We don't want to just be set up on a way, but I have a question for Evan here. Evan, what are the main regarding performance, right? With companies that are PRC, the People's Republic of China-based firms, do you see any different in performances from those firms that are PRC backed or based firms and other firms regarding ESG issues?
It's a great question, Pablo. And first of all, I don't see that it's necessarily because a firm is Chinese managed or not. There are certain things that arise from that. One is oftentimes if a firm, especially coming from China, is new to the region, and especially the difference between culture and things, especially if they come in quickly through a merger acquisition, oftentimes that creates certain tensions between the headquarters organization and policies and the local management. Oftentimes they come in also, and there's a certain amount of local suspicion. As I mentioned before, also there are different levels of pressure. There's very far from the empire. Sense that Chinese firms abroad face a temptation to feel that they have limited oversight, and so cut corners to try to save costs and show a profit. So there are certain tendencies. But having said that, there was an interesting study done by within actually Peru that showed that Chinese firms certainly are not uniformly bad, nor are they always the worst in the sector. But nor are they the best. And again, you have significant differences between, for example, firms such as China Aluminum Corporation, Chinalco, which hired did a pretty good job of hiring some local consulting and expertise in dealing with the move of the 5,000 member community of Morococho versus others like Men Metals or previously Shogang that have had other difficulties. So and oftentimes it's also a factor of the resources of the firm itself. Again, in the electricity sector, you see that some firms like State Grid, and I've seen this personally, have relatively good efforts for training programs at the managerial level to prepare their people for some of these issues. Other firms, especially at the subnational level, not so much. But there are certain tendencies that, and the other thing I think it's important to recognize is that this is not, and I think the the importance was emphasized by my colleagues of how this can affect the bottom line and performance and stakeholder issues. But this is also a geopolitical issue. I would dare to say that, from a Washington standpoint, that the idea of Chinese sensitivity of the charge of Chinese firms being particularly poor in their compliance, labor management, things like that, puts Chinese companies under an extra microscope that can impede their performance. And so in many ways, it's something that the Chinese companies have to, I think, be even more sensitive to in their relations with the country in which they're operating.
Thank you. John, Claudia, you want to add anything to that view, Evan's view?
No, I don't think so, Pablo. But Claudia, why don't you go ahead?
Actually, I know time is on the essence, and I know we have 3 minutes already. So, I mean,
I'll jump on a
the
couple
rules of
questions.
the rules of the game have been set, Pablo, and are clear. So,
Yeah.
we actually align to those rules, or we're gonna have problems.
But that's my question, right? Regarding about the experience on there. Do you know, or has your company started, develop an ESG former policy program? How many companies that have real making those changes here? It was just a wave that everybody's thinking that is coming.
It is a wave, and you need to run if you want to go with the flow. Number one, yes, we implement it. John, go ahead, please.
You got it.
I was just gonna say we implemented, and actually, I was coming from the mining sector where we could implement, and we actually implement ESG like 10 years ago when this was not in fashion, and then moving to the telecommunications sector with foreign investment, you have a shareholder agreement telling you company must operate under an ESG perspective, and this is actually integrated into our compliance program. So it's one thing done from the very first day, especially because we operate in rural locations.
Okay. John?
The other thing I was going to say is, certainly we are seeing an enormous amount of activity by companies who are either publicly listed or are facing a scrutiny, in the West, in the United States, and Canada, in Western Europe in particular. And so we are seeing a great deal of activity, whether it's policies, procedures, programs, and other affirmative internal steps, risk assessments, all of that, as it bears on Latin America and the impact of Chinese companies in Latin America. We are certainly seeing where Chinese companies will intersect with subsidiaries and others in the Latin American market, a great deal of attention and activity, including due diligence. And so we are seeing a lot in terms of the movement more generally, and specifically when we look at Latin America, the intersection of ESG and Chinese companies as they might impact Western business.
Thank you, John. So since we started a little bit late, I'm going to ask the last question. It's going to be for everybody. So we know after the
No worries
after
about the time. No worries about the time.
What's that?
No worries about the time.
Oh, good. So since we experienced the pandemic, and now we're actually thinking that our Christmas gift will not arrive on time. Something that we in the U.S., I guess, we're probably and a lot of companies are thinking in U.S.-based companies trying to change their China dependence for their supply chain. And I see we're not only talking about about doom and gloom or things that you have to do. I see this as a tremendous opportunity for Latin America. This is something that we've been discussing for a long time when the pandemic hit. So do you guys, Evan, Claudia, and John, do you see that as an opportunity? For example, I was thinking that the DOJ just passed a anti-corruption line in Central America, so they can combat corruption, directly with the FBI and the DOJ. In my opinion, they're trying to set the rules for a way in US-based companies they're so dependent on China, and we have I don't know how many boats waiting in the LA port. And then, for some Central America, it could be phenomenal for that opportunity. You have, the two oceans here. So I'll leave it up to you guys to see what you guys think. And I think, Evan, you're
Sure. Okay. So I will strongly say yes and no. And I know nearshoring is something that's very popular, very much in mode right now. And certainly there are, coming out of COVID-19 political pressures as well as business pressures, given what's happened with the with international logistics coming out of Asia, et cetera. I think though there are some constraints. Number one is the long-term lack of supporting infrastructure in Latin America, especially for intra-regional trade to really make effective, Latin America concentrated supply chains. Number two, there are some legal and community issues that I think my colleagues know about well that really give companies a pause to operating in certain areas. And frankly, also from a company bottom line standpoint, there are other options. And so, for example, some companies right now looking at some of the risks are looking at making adjustments in inventory or alternative, essentially redundant supply chains, or rather than necessarily just moving options to a place which is geographically closer. And of course, geographically closer doesn't always mean necessarily cheaper. So my sense is that we will see a partial tendency towards nearshoring, and as that happens, the associated investment will increase the importance of these types of ESG issues, because to succeed, they will need to deal with that in a Latin America context, very politically mobilized and very sensitive to them. But at the same time, I think we will not see a universal rush to nearshoring.
John and Claudia, any thoughts about that?
Go ahead, Claudia.
I was just gonna say this is very simple and very useful when we talk about compliance, but also when we talk about ESG. There needs to be the board level commitment from day one to ensure those dependency on Chinese third parties or any other Chinese company is actually well investigated and controlled.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think due diligence, effective due diligence with an understanding that really is creates a level of policy coherence that runs through the board is 100% right, and completely agree with that observation.
Okay, we have, thank you guys. We have a question here from Liam. Liam says, does the intersection of operations between Chinese companies and local subsidiaries present wider ESG risks to either party, particularly in relation to social license concerns and activist/campaigning activity?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's wider concerns, but it definitely creates social license risk, and that's quite frankly where I see the biggest potential risk, that where you do have the intersection of we'll call it poor ESG performance, regardless of whether it's a Chinese company or anywhere else, but particularly for a non-domestic company, regardless of its country of origin. So a foreign company that is having a negative ESG impact on a local community in connection with a global company, and this is a subsidiary. Yeah, you have huge social license issues, and it goes beyond just pure legal issues or formal licensing issues or permitting. It goes to operation, the ability of an operation to continue. Absolutely goes to global reputation and brand. So I do think that it can have real impacts when you marry up these different ingredients, regardless of whether it's a Chinese company or any other kind of foreign company that is operating in a domestic market with a poor ESG performance associated with it.
And
Go ahead, guys.
lastly, Pablo, to add to John's comment, is like, we know that the governments in Latin America are still not applying sanctions or fees for ESG failures, but I don't know what is worst. Is either having the community putting at risk your social license to operate, and then the media taking care of broadcast your failure, or the government asking you to pay a fine on this regard.
And I think if I can jump in also, I think it's important, especially with Chinese companies, to distinguish between different types of risks. I mean, obviously, the performance risk and financial risk of difficulties, with social mobilization or legal issues. I mean, that's going to affect the company one way or another, and so that doesn't change. In terms of reputational risks, you take a look, for example, China State Construction Engineering Corporation. I believe doing business as China Construction Americas. Well, it may be that maybe that doesn't hurt the parent company as much if China Construction Americas takes the hit. For example, what would happen with the problems in the Bahamas with Baja Mar. But at the same time, there's also a reputational risk against Chinese companies in general, in a certain and there's a broad spectrum of those companies, and so again, you have, for example, some of the ways in which Huawei is set up. It's still seen as Huawei. You have others where the Chinese nature is less apparent, but the majority of the risks, I think, continue, whether however the local partnership is set up. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but that's what I see in terms of the political pushback and impact of companies there.
Rafael, you want to say something about the two, or anything you want to add? Okay. All right. Go ahead, Rafa. I think that's a wrap.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all of our panelists on behalf of the Houston Bar Association and the International Law Section. We greatly appreciate this. Could have been two panels, one in ESG specifically, another one in China, but the intersection between the two in Latin America specifically is fascinating. And it's definitely going to be a topic that we should be discussing. Juan Carlos Pasco put it in the chat. Very well said, that ESG is a growing topic and more events like this are needed. So as mentioned, this is not something that is going to go away. This is something that is going to continue to grow, and I think every one of us needs to be mindful of it. Now, for those of you who need it, we have a CLE number for the credit. It is 174137497. You should have received it in your registration email. It's at the very bottom of the email. So if you need it, search for it right there, or again, 174137497. Thank you so much to everyone for attending, and to our panelists, again, a round of applause. Thank you so much for participating. It was fabulous.
Thank you, Rafael, for the invite.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.